Welcome to Captain Forest podcast Hero's Voice. Captain Forest is an international movement for a plastic-free, waste-free and permaculture world.
We've dealt with our plastic recycling targets, but actually, this plastic is being mismanaged, not because of the fault of these countries where we're exporting waste to, but because they're already over capacity and we're dumping our problem kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Hello everyone, welcome to Hero's Voice by Captain Forest. Today we are happy to welcome our three international speakers. Christina Dixon from the UK. She's Ocean Campaign Leader at the International Investigation Agency, and she will speak about the context and expectations from the Plastics Treaty. Nina van Toulon from Netherlands. She's co-founder of the International Waste Platform, and she will speak about plastic waste management challenges in Asia. And Doun Moon from Korea. She's policy researcher at the Global Alliance for the Incinerator Alternatives, and she will speak about the impacts of plastic on climate and the need for a full life cycle instrument. So why do we need a plastics treaty? Plastic is part of the triple environmental crisis: biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. Plastic pollution has no policy instrument. Plastic global governance is fragmented and insufficient, so there is a need for a plastics treaty urgently. Negotiations kicked off in February 2022 and will end by December 2024. So today we are going to speak about the context of the plastics treaty, the environmental and social impacts of plastic, the plastic waste management challenges in Asia, and the expectations from the first round of negotiations in Uruguay. So, Christina, can you tell us what's the context of the Plastics Treaty and what are the environmental and social impacts of plastic?
I'm going to try and do this efficiently and try not to be too technical, but we can always elaborate a little bit and feel free to jump in and ask questions if anything is not clear. So how did we get here to negotiating a new treaty on plastics? It might seem like it happened kind of overnight, but it's sort of the story goes back many years. And really the sort of environment in which this decision comes about is kind of a growing recognition about the diversity of the problems associated with plastic pollution, and the recognition that plastic pollutes across the full life cycle. I heard this statistic recently about how if the plastics life cycle was a country, it would be the fifth largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So if it was a country, it would be the fifth. So it's not just a problem to do with, whether you throw away your straw or you reuse your cup. Like, these things are of course like relevant and important, but we're actually talking about a problem which is driving the climate emergency and also impacting on biodiversity loss. And it's a problem that's in our oceans, but it's also a problem that's in our bodies. In plastics, there's 10,000 chemicals, and about a quarter of those are substances of concern. And there's actually nothing that right now that is looking at the chemicals in plastics and regulating them to make sure that there's product safety, for example. There's no controls on how much plastic is being produced. There's no global packaging standards that mean that we're designing problematic types of plastics out of packaging at a global scale, or indeed encouraging companies with a legal instrument to make sure they're designing products that can be easily recycled or reused, for example. So these are just a few things. It's a really huge and complex topic, but I just think the thing to bear in mind is that when we're thinking about the plastics treaty, we're not just thinking about packaging, we're thinking about all plastics, and we're also thinking about plastics throughout their life cycles. So that ranges from, communities who are living on the front line in petrochemical facilities, where they're basically being exposed to the toxic emissions of plastic production, right through to people in the informal sector who are managing plastic waste at its end of life, and also, plastic pollution in the marine environment. So here's just kind of some of the news articles that were out in the last year or so. Really there's a kind of big global momentum around this topic. Everybody's talking about it. We're starting to hear governments from landlocked Rwanda, for example, to Peru, to the European Union, but also this is really quite global South led. These countries have been really disproportionately impacted by plastic pollution, particularly through things like the trade in plastic waste. So high consuming countries exporting our problems to the global South, where we basically can say, job done, we've dealt with our plastic recycling targets, but actually this plastic is being mismanaged, not because of the fault of these countries where we're exporting waste to, but because they're already over capacity and we're dumping our problem kind of out of sight, out of mind. So this is a kind of complex global system in which plastic pollution exists, and that's kind of where this concern came about, that we need to deal with plastic production, because we can have measures on, you know, the waste trade, on remediation, improving waste management, but at the end of the day, you can't deal with plastic pollution without dealing with plastic production. And because we don't have a kind of comprehensive view of regulation when it comes to plastics, this is why we need to have a plastics treaty. And this call has come from the civil society sector in particular. So this is just a snapshot of some of the people who were there when the negotiating mandate was agreed in Nairobi earlier this year. But it's a huge, diverse coalition of NGOs and activists from around the world. But we also have this group called SNEP, which is the Scientists Network for an Effective Plastics Treaty. We also have a business coalition, and we also have a high ambition coalition of countries which are committed to an ambitious treaty. So there's these kind of different constellations of stakeholders who are really concerned and want to make sure that this treaty is fit for purpose. So the story in terms of like the kind of, I guess, legal evolution of this is that at the UN Environment Assembly, which is the highest environmental decision-making body in the world, there's been a series of what's known as resolutions. And resolutions are basically where governments come together and agree to some text about what they want to see on a particular topic. And there's kind of very sort of UN-specific language that you see, you know, when they sort of note a problem, they recognize a problem. And then what we've seen, you know, since around 2014 is the language around plastic pollution really escalating, becoming more urgent, as you know, each time the UN Environment Assembly is meeting, saying, yeah, we sort of agreed that this was a problem 2 years ago, but we haven't really done anything except collect more knowledge. And right now we're at a point where we definitely have enough knowledge to act. So that's why in March 2022 there was this decision to get the negotiating mandate for the treaty. This is the moment when the gavel went down. I just love this. This is a really cool moment. You don't normally get to celebrate stuff when you work in environmental policy. It's generally like a bit of a downer. So it was quite nice to have something to get excited about. And so what's in this mandate? I mean, like, I don't want to go into all of the details, but I think just a few kind of key things is that, as you mentioned, Lamia, it's going to take 2 years to negotiate. It's a full life cycle approach. So there's scope within this decision to talk about things like sustainable production and consumption of plastics, product design, waste management, you know, what the kind of financial assistance will look like for implementing the agreement. That's really important, especially for developing countries, because it's no good creating legal infrastructure and saying this is what you guys have to do, but then not actually provide any financing to enable that to happen. So that's where other environmental agreements have really fallen down. There's lots of stuff in there. I'm not going to go into all of this, but I guess just things to consider is kind of what role could the treaty play in things like product standards, restrictions on chemical additives, what are going to be the requirements for reporting? Like, are we going to make petrochemical companies finally legally obliged to report on how much plastic they're producing and what's in those plastics? That would be fantastic to see. But also provisions around the informal sector, so like waste pickers, how to incorporate indigenous and traditional knowledge, that kind of thing. So this is just the timeline. So this will be the next 2 years that we're negotiating, and then open for adoption in 2025. So it's a really tight timeline, but there is precedence. This slide just basically illustrates like how long it can take to negotiate international environmental agreements. And some of them you can see take a really, really long time, but some of them have been negotiated really quickly. And the main takeaway from this slide is that when there's been a case where an issue has been recognized as having huge kind of urgency and global importance, and there's political will, it can be done quickly. So the naysayers who are like, this will take, you know, this will end up taking 10 years. Actually, that's not true. There's precedent for it happening much faster. And this is an example where people are really invested in the issue. I just kind of threw this slide in here to just kind of, these are some things that we might talk about maybe when we're discussing around like what some of the battleground areas might be. So I think the things like chemicals, transparency, what's going to be legally binding, what's going to be voluntary, what does sustainable production and consumption of plastic actually mean? Like that terminology really needs to be defined in order to be relevant. So these are some of the issues that will come up during the discussions. And then just I wanted to include this. I know it's often asked, like, what are NGOs and civil society doing, or like what can we do? And I think, for your captain forest community, like thinking about activism and engaging in a process that can seem quite high level and UN-y, I think it's really important to kind of think about, like, there are things you can do. You can host webinars exactly like this, to inform people, engage different voices in the conversation, campaigning activities, analyzing legal and technical stuff, also policy at the national level, also building relationships with your national government, because they're the ones who are going to be negotiating this text kind of on your behalf. So you really want to kind of start building those relationships so you can kind of reach out to them. That's just a few examples. We can talk about that further. And that's it. And I'm sorry that was a really long answer to your question, but I hope that it sets some context for what we're going to hear from Doun and Nina coming after this. So that's it really. But thanks.
So thank you, Christina. It was very insightful, and thank you for sharing with us this background about the plastics treaty. And as you said, we need to take more upstream measures in order to tackle the plastics crisis. Nina is here with us to speak about waste management challenges. So Nina, can you tell us more from your experience, the challenges that you met to manage plastic waste in Asia?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, first of all, thanks, Christina, for this great explanation about the process. So in Indonesia, we face many problems, as everybody knows. So one of which is the geography, 17,000 plus islands and 54,000 more kilometers of coastline. So we have this organization, which is actually a platform to connect stakeholders and to promote collaboration. It's called the Indonesian Waste Platform, and we are co-initiator of the International Waste Platform, because in many countries there are similar organizations. And in each country there are, it's like a cross-sector collaboration. So in Indonesia, we focus on news sharing and on developing best practices, especially in remote regions, because approximately 50% of the population lives in remote and rural regions where the collection systems are very low developed. So we thought, okay, because there is a focus, of course, on establishing collection systems in urban regions, but the rural regions are the most challenging. So we collect waste from fishing communities on islands, on outlying islands of a main island of Flores in a Komodo National Park. And we do that with EPR funding. And so we are a big supporter of EPR because in Indonesia, there is already a decree from the Ministry of Environment that producers need to contribute funds to collection, education, and improving their packaging. So there are guidelines how to improve their packaging. But in our work, our first focus is always on reduction, because we cannot solve this problem by recycling. We have to reduce the production. So we do that by refilling. Can I share my screen?
First.
Okay, one moment. Share. Yeah. So can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, we promote the reuse economy. So obviously, reusables also need to be recycled because everything needs to remain in the loop. But our focus is on promoting refilling, and this is quite challenging because there are some limitations in the Indonesian law about which products you are allowed to use in refilling. But step by step, we're just doing it. And so this is the big problem in all the packaging in Indonesia. So it's actually in Indonesia, there's data that 70% of Indonesian people buy single-use, single portion products in this type of sachets, small or even, the bigger pouches. And we find them everywhere. And So the consequence of this packaging, which cannot be recycled, is that it's being openly burned in a household level, or it's littered, directly thrown in the sea. We see that happening every day. Or it's going to a landfill if it's collected, and there the landfills also often are burning because they need to create space, or they are spontaneously burning because of methane or batteries exploding or whatever. So yeah, this is what we've been doing the last half year. There are more refill projects going on in Indonesia, but we did this one, piloting it in our area. And then I like to show this Planet Reuse, which is a really great platform. It's actually more European focused, but this is also promoting the reuse economy. So it's working towards reduction of the use of packaging. And yeah, so in Indonesia on the ground, we do this program on refilling, collecting waste from the fishing community, so people don't need to burn it and don't need to litter it. And actually, I'm very pro recycling, because obviously we're not going to get rid of all this packaging anytime soon. And every day tons are going into rivers, oceans, on land, burning, etc. So we need a thriving recycling sector also for reusables, because if you move towards the reuse economy, you also need to reuse those, recycle those materials. So we work very closely with the Indonesian Plastic Association, Plastic Recycling Association, ADUPI. They are our direct partners, because everything what we collect from the fishing islands, which cannot be reduced, we send directly to them on Java. And we don't use any plastic credit systems, because it's not transparent. We collect our own data on what we collect, how many kilos of PET, HDPE, LDPE, whatever, glass, carton, cans, and we weigh it, we bale it, we sort it, and we ship it to Java. And that brings me to the next problem in Indonesia. The recycling sector is mainly located on Java, really high-tech factories. I mean, the same factories like you have them in Europe or anywhere in the world. But the problem is to get stuff there. And it breaks my heart in a way that we are collecting stuff which actually can be recycled, but it's going in one trip to the island in a dirty diesel boat engine, then coming back to the mainland, then we have to truck it to our sorting center. There it's compressed using electricity. Then it goes back to the harbor. Then it goes again via diesel transport to Java, to the harbor, from a truck to the recycling factory. So it's, and then of course in the recycling factory itself, it's also using lots of water and energy. So the whole recycling chain itself is also an issue, or the collection system that needs to be obviously decarbonized. And that's not happening everywhere. In Holland it is, for example, in some places where they combine recycling organics with producing biogas and compost, and the gas, is the energy for their collection fleet, for the trucks. But that is not happening in Indonesia. There might be some electric trucks going around, but not where we are. Also in Indonesia, and together with our network partners at the International Waste Platform, we looked at labels on packaging in many countries, in Africa, Asian countries, and I think we found none which are adequate. They're not truthful, they're not verifiable, there's no recyclability verification mandatory, etc. So all these points actually we've put in a letter to the UN in 2020, a wish list for what we would like to see in this plastic treaty. So we do know they received it because we got a reply, but at that time the points were too detailed for this treaty, because they were still negotiating who would support this treaty, etc. But I also love the picture of the gavel. It's very hope-giving. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nina. So if
Yeah.
we understand well, recycling is important, and thank you for all you did in Indonesia there. It's also very challenging because most of the recycling is done in Java, but then you have all the plastic that is in rural areas that you need to collect and bring them back to Java, and it's very challenging to do it because it's centralized and you don't have any other recycling facilities elsewhere. And beyond the recycling, the downstream measures, we also need upstream measures. And we know that we need more regulations to regulate how companies operate in order to reduce plastic and plastic pollution. So Doun, are you here with us?
I am.
Hello.
Hello,
So,
can you hear me?
yeah, perfectly.
Great.
So Doun, can you tell us about the impacts of plastic on climate?
Yes, of course. Let me also share my screen. I happen to have some. So, hello everyone. My name is Doun Moon. I'm with GAIA, Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. And I'm here to speak about the climate impacts of plastic and the importance of taking a full life cycle approach when we address plastic issues, and also a little bit about LCA, life cycle assessment, but I think that's the next question. And first of all, thank you, Lania, and also Chris and Nina. It gives me hopes to see how the treaty conversations are going. And also, Nina, when you brought up the reuse economy, it was uplifting. So thank you for that. So when it comes to climate impacts, we need to look into different stages of the life cycle of plastic, including the fossil fuel extraction and plastic manufacturing stages. So what happens in the fossil fuel extraction stage is related to where plastic comes from. And the answer is that 99% of plastic comes from fossil fuel, namely crude oil, coal, and natural gas. So in the extraction phase of plastic life cycle, we need to drill and frack to get those materials to be able to make plastics. And it is very energy intensive, and you have to use a lot of water and chemicals as well. So it adds to the toxicity issues. And when it comes to production and manufacturing side of things, you have to break hydrocarbons into smaller pieces of hydrocarbons, which is a process called cracking. And it is also an energy intensive process. So combining these two, more than 60% of the carbon footprint of plastic comes from these two stages. So we have to really consider upstream emissions when we look into the plastic carbon footprint. And then we have the consumer use, transportation, and disposal of plastic waste. And I am going to zoom in to talk about the end of life options of plastic and their climate impact a little bit. So we have three options here: recycling and landfilling and incineration. And if you look at recycling, it is the most desirable way of treating plastic. If you look into the climate impacts only, but it has, the reason is because we can displace the need to extract more virgin materials by recycling stuff, but there are huge limitations in plastic recycling. You know, it's a well-known fact now that only 9% of all plastic that has ever made since the 1950s has been recycled, and 12% has been incinerated, and the rest has been dumped or landfilled. So we don't really have high hopes for recycling because of its low recyclability, barriers in the process, the high contamination rate, and the lack of markets, and other issues. But when it comes to plastic, climate impacts, recycling is the best option. And landfilling doesn't really emit greenhouse gases when we landfill plastic, but there are fire hazards in the landfills, and also it leaches toxic chemicals into the land and water, so we have to take that into consideration. And the third option here is incineration, which is basically a climate disaster. So when you burn 1 ton of plastic, you get more than 2.7 tons of greenhouse gases. And even with energy recovery, you will still get more than 1.4 tons of fossil CO2. So treating plastic in incineration facilities is the worst option to get rid of plastic. And on the right side, you can see a chart where you see the benefits of recycling plastic, which is negative by displacing the virgin material. And landfill only adds a little bit because it's greenhouse gas emissions associated with transportation and hauling and washing and sorting. And then for incineration, this is the net emissions even after considering the energy recovery processes. You can see that it's very high. And here in our report done with Center for International Environmental Law in 2019, we compared 4 scenarios where we either reduce plastic production or waste incineration. And the result is that only by reducing plastic, we get climate benefits. And by reducing either of them, it's mediocre. So we have to really try to reduce the amount of plastic produced in the first place. I think one more point about climate impacts of plastic is the carbon footprint of chemical recycling. So nowadays, this is promoted as a new magical solution to plastic crisis. But when you think about it, you lose energy by trying to produce the material plastic, and then by trying to depolymerize it again into plastic, it's also very energy intensive, and there's lots of energy needed for pre-treatment and post-processing because of the low quality of fuel, the outputs. So it's a loop that goes smaller and smaller when it comes to the amount of material preserved. And also in the process, you lose a lot of energy, consuming heat and energy during the process. Yeah, so I think that's my point about the climate impacts of plastic and the importance of looking into the full life cycle instead of just looking the plastic crisis as a marine debris problem or this end of life problem. So I'm sure many of you have seen some LCA studies, life cycle assessments done in comparison between plastic and other materials. For example, is it better to use plastic bags versus glass containers or cotton bags? And oftentimes the industry uses some studies citing the findings that actually plastic is better because it's more lightweight and doesn't emit that much greenhouse gases on the way. So we have to be careful with these LCA studies because oftentimes what they don't include in their methodology is the emissions that are associated with extraction and manufacture. The fracking and cracking processes, highly energy intensive processes, and also a lot of LCAs don't include toxicity analysis that are resulting from the fact that plastic doesn't biodegrade, but it just gets broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, becoming microplastic, polluting the ocean and the land. And also in the production side, what's often neglected is the pellet. So there's this pellet loss problem, which occurs oftentimes when plastic pellets are transported from different places. And it's not considered in many LCAs, even though it has to be, given the impact to the ecosystems. And also animal ingestion or entanglement and microplastic spreading around, they are not factored into the studies. So it's really tricky to get a complete LCA. So it has been misused by the industry to promote single-use plastic items. And that's why we need to be careful and make sure that at least those LCAs include the extraction side of greenhouse gas emission. I think that's what I wanted to say about LCAs.
Okay, thank you. So all of these are needed to be considered in if we had to have a new LCA instrument in order to assess the full impact of plastics on the environment. Thank you, Doun, for sharing with us these insights. And now I have a question for Christina. So the first round of negotiation will take place in Uruguay. Can you tell us what are the expectations from this round of negotiations?
Yeah, sure, no problem. And thanks also just for those really interesting insights. I also love the idea of debunking the industry LCAs because I'm so tired of hearing this argument in favor of plastic. Anyway, yeah, so this first round of negotiations is like the first official round, but there was a preparatory meeting which took place in May of this year in Dakar, it's called the Open-Ended Working Group, which was really a kind of pre-meeting to sort of agree some of the principles of how the negotiations will run. But this first meeting, I think it's really important to kind of manage expectations about what would actually happen because, so it's the first of 5 rounds of negotiations, and what's really on the agenda here is quite procedural. It's about like how will we negotiate, so in what kind of sequence of work. If you look at how other multilateral environmental agreements have been negotiated in the past, they tend to look at all of the topics that are like available within the scope of work and think, you know, which topics are likely to require several rounds of negotiation, which topics are likely to be complex or politically difficult, you know, what are the topics that are going to require further information, or what could be dealt with quite easily and come later. And so that this kind of work on sequencing is really important. And so, you know, it's clear that some topics are going to be really difficult, like financing. So that should definitely be dealt with early because it will require several rounds of negotiation. Also, thinking about things like national action plans, there's no point really in discussing national obligations early because we don't have agreed the global obligations yet. So national action plans could come later. So that's kind of what this first meeting will really look at, like what's going to be complicated, how do we want to organize the work, and then how do we tackle that? So it's kind of setting up the process. And it's also dealing with things like rules of procedure. So this is like really like sort of nerdy UN stuff, but really like how the meetings will be run, like be run in practice, like what are there any kind of requirements on voting, because it's really like a consensus-based decision-making model. So whilst a lot of this was dealt with in Dakar, it wasn't actually all finalized. So when we first go into this meeting, we have to adopt those rules of procedure, and also agree. A number of countries, I think it's 12, sit on the bureau. And this group of 12 people, like 12 people representing their countries, are responsible for guiding the work over the next 2 years. And so they need to elect a chair. And that role is really important because it's like having a good chair is how we prevent this entire negotiations from being derailed and taking, you know, longer than the planned 2 years. So a good chair is able to kind of identify problems early, deal with them, you know, direct like little groups of countries to go off and work out problems and report back, like these kind of process things. And so that's the role of the chair. So in the first couple of the days of the meeting, we'll discuss these types of things. And then the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, have provided a bunch of documents for consideration for this meeting. And they deal with things like what is all the science that we know about plastics? And so it's a kind of summary paper. This is the plastic science document. Here's a glossary of terms. And so the glossary of terms is really interesting because many people have been really familiar with plastics, plastic pollution, and everything in this kind of family for a long time. But there are going to be some delegations who are they've just been told by their government, you know, you need to now be the contact point on plastics, and they might not have really worked in this space before. So it sounds really obvious, but we need to have a common working understanding about what is meant by plastics and what is meant by plastic pollution. And I don't necessarily mean that we need to spend days having a discussion on a legal definition of these things, but we do need to have a kind of common working understanding because, for example, like just to make this concrete, if we're viewing plastics as a material as well as a product, that means that when we're considering the interventions for dealing with plastic pollution, we're also thinking about kind of extraction and production. If we only understand plastics as a product, then it's like we're starting everything from kind of pellets and down. So like really it's a kind of like product design and waste management treaty. So it's really important that we start to think about the framing of this. Like we're really looking at plastics in a material sense. So how are plastics produced? What is going into them? And for example, you know, the industry would very much like it if this treaty started at the product design stage, because it would then remove obligations further upstream to deal with production. And so a lot of the framing that we're seeing from the plastic producers is like basically the plastics treaty starts at the point of product design, because it means then all of the obligations are on the fast moving consumer goods companies, on packaging, on the people making plastic products. So these are the types of things that will be discussed just to get everybody to a common understanding of like what are the problems that we're trying to solve, because we can't set an agreement, like an objective for the agreement without first understanding the problem that we're trying to solve. And so that might be a little bit frustrating for some people who've spent already kind of like 5-6 years in pre-negotiations to get to this point, but it's essential that especially from countries that are lower capacity, so they might have a smaller delegation, less technical expertise in their government, that everybody is kind of brought on this journey together. So yeah, I think these are kind of some of the outcomes that we might expect. So a kind of structure of work, which work is going to happen when, what will happen intersessionally. So between the INCs, there will need to be some intersessional work, like a common kind of working understanding of the language that we're going to use to talk about the problem, and some common principles with regards to the actual objective of the agreement. So, you know, is the objective of the treaty to end plastic pollution and develop a kind of safe circular economy for plastics that's protective of the environment and human health, like that would sound a little bit like some other similar agreements that deal with other materials, like who knows. So that kind of needs to start being discussed. Apart from that, I mean, one thing that's really interesting about this first meeting is that for those of us that have been following the previous meetings, there hasn't actually been a huge industry presence. But now for this meeting, we're seeing a lot more industry suddenly paying attention, sending big delegations. And that's something that's going to change a little bit the dynamics, because another aspect that's kind of relevant to the rules of procedure is about how stakeholders engage with this process. So, you know, the treaty is negotiated by governments, right? It's a government to government negotiation. But there is a role for civil society, for NGOs, for waste pickers, for indigenous peoples, frontline communities, but also industry to kind of inform this process, provide expert input, participate, collaborate with governments to kind of provide the information at the right time. But it needs to be fair and equitable. So there needs to be a voice for all stakeholders. And the last thing that we want to see is this negotiation to be kind of co-opted by the industry. So it's a really important role for civil society actually to watch what's happening and kind of criticize where appropriate the role of industry in this space as well, because there's precedent in other agreements where, you know, polluters or the kind of companies that are responsible for a problem. So like, say, if you look at the tobacco regulation, you know, they shouldn't really be allowed to participate in a negotiation that is directly impacting the industry that's kind of causing the problem that's being regulated. So how would that play out in this? Because like, is it appropriate if plastic producers are coming to these meetings, if we're trying to regulate their industry, which they've kind of not been able to deal with for the last few decades? In fact, they've actively been trying not to deal with it. So these are kind of things that really, like, the conversations that are happening about how do we, like, okay, yes, we need fair and equitable stakeholder participation, but what about the polluters? Like, what's their role in this? So that's something to look at as well. Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, I could probably go on for ages, but that's just the kind of overview of like what some of the things that I'm thinking about with this first meeting.
Okay.
Is really reading the room actually to see how things change now that the negotiations are formally starting and what that's going to mean for the next couple of years, because I think a lot of the strategy, both for governments and for NGOs, will be informed a little bit by how this first meeting goes, because it's the first kind of really serious meeting when people are starting to really define their positions about how they're going to negotiate this treaty.
Okay, thank you, Christina. And I think you're going there. Yeah.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
To hear about the conclusions after the end of this first round of negotiations. So as a conclusion of our webinar today, there is a plastic issue emergency. Plastics are made from fossil fuels and their additives contain toxins and they never truly biodegrade. Their production has a direct impact on both climate change and biodiversity loss, and their end of life is problematic, whether when incinerated, recycled, or in landfill. Plastic presents a severe threat to planetary boundaries, and yet we see that petrochemical companies are expanding plastic production to maintain profitability. There is a need urgently for a plastics treaty, and there are several expectations. First, to avoid crossing a third planetary boundary, we need to phase down plastics production to sustainable levels urgently. We also need to upscale reuse systems, refill and traditional packaging systems. Second, to align with climate objectives, we need to design a legally binding instrument that addresses the entire LCA, considering the total plastic greenhouse gas emissions at the extraction, refinement, and end-of-life phases. Third, we need to protect human health, and for this we need to regulate toxic substances added to plastics. Finally, we need to protect workers employed by the informal sector, and for this we need to engage communities in negotiations and promote a just transition to a more circular economy.